Hey class, it's Dr. Olson. I want to talk to you about ethics. This is a really central part of anthropology. We've talked about cultural relativism in the first unit of the class and talked about naive realism, a lot of things that are central to anthropology, and I want to talk about ethics. So let's start with this. This is from your reading from the American Anthropological Association. Okay, so what are ethics? And how are they related to anthropological research? Let's read through this quote, and I've added emphasis on things that we should think about. So ethics and morals differ in important ways. The complex issues that anthropologists confront rarely admit to the simple wrongs and rights of moral dicta. And one of the prime ethical obligations of anthropologists is to carefully and deliberately weigh the consequences and ethical dimensions of the choices they make, by action or inaction. Similarly, ethical principles and political positions should not be conflated. Their foci of concern are quite distinct. And finally, ethics and law differ in important ways, and care must always be taken in making these distinctions. Different processes are involved in making ethical versus legal decisions, and they are subject to different regulations. So while moral, political, legal, and regulatory issues are often important to anthropological practice and the discipline, they are not specifically considered here. These principles address ethical concerns. And this is in the prelude to the ethical guidelines for the American Anthropological Association. So let's just recap and unpack a few of the big points that are there. Ethics and morals are different. Morals are what's like right and wrong to do, and ethics are different because they're more complex, and morals are really structured by culture. So one culture will say, if it's morally right or wrong to do certain things or something, right? If it's, well, I don't want to pick an example because they get really tricky, right? But you could pick something like kicking a dog. Is it okay to kick a dog? And now in Mexico, I've seen people do this a lot, right? Where they'll, just like a street dog or something, you'll see people kick a dog. But, even if the dog's barking at me, my gut instinct is I don't want to kick at a dog, right? Because I'm an American. So that's one of those like moral things, and it's not, so morals are like that. But then there's ethical things which take it broader and say, are you hurting the animal? Is there a greater harm? And ethics attempt to take there's different perspectives in ethics, but many ethical perspectives try and take more of an acultural or a bicultural or multicultural approach. And so it can get really complex and things like that. So this is why ethical decision making is really complicated. And for anthropologists, most of the time it's whether or not, right, like they say in the statement, by action or inaction. Am I creating harm or doing the wrong thing by doing something, by intervening, or by not intervening? We'll look at some examples in a minute. And then, so ethics are different from politics. Political positions are different from ethical positions, okay? And that's different from law because ethics and law, like law, there's a process through which laws are created, a very clear and definite process. And ethical decision making is really just a different process. It's ideally much more inclusive and things like that. Okay, not that creating laws is not inclusive, but the process will be different in ethical decision making because we're going to try and look at more possibilities for inclusion into the decision making. Okay, let's go on to some specific examples. I think this will help. So the AAA Code of Ethics says first, do no harm. Well, we all agree, right? That's a pretty easy one. But you can think of some of the case studies we've read and studied this year. Okay, so for example, Well, I'll give you an example from my own, the one that we haven't read, but an example from my own work. When I did my first field school with the National Science Foundation, we were in the Amazon in Bolivia, and we were working with hunter-gatherers, traditional forager tribes in the Amazon, deep in the jungle. And one of the things that was a rule that our the field leaders said, because there were 3 of us students, and they said, we don't bring any alcohol into the communities, none. We don't bring alcohol in, and we don't drink. They said, look, because you're there for a number of months. We were there for 3 months. They said, look, on the weekends when we're in town or whatever, you want to go out and drink or something, that's fine. But when we're out in the villages, you don't bring any alcohol. There's no alcohol consumption. Why? Well, because of the ways that alcohol has had such a rampant and negative impact on indigenous and native communities. And so it would be completely negligent of us to be introducing alcohol. Even if we brought it for like, oh, this whiskey is just for me. Well, first of all, that's rude. But second of all, we just didn't, none of that behavior was going to be introduced by us into the villages. The second thing is be open and honest about your work. We don't go undercover. This isn't, it's not like, secret operations or something. I once had a student who said, we were at it wasn't at SU, it was in a different city, but we were at a health fair that we were putting on, and I had my students it was an applied anthropology project that they were helping to organize parts of this health fair for the community, and so we helped organize it, and then they were helping to observe it. And at one point during the health fair, we had like 300 kids there running around doing different activities and things, and I couldn't find him because we needed a lot of help. Like the students were helping put this together, and I'd find him, and he was like leaned into this corner taking notes copiously in his notebook. And I said, what are you doing? And he said, well, I'm taking notes. I'm watching all the kids' behavior. And I said, that's not how we do it. So what we do as anthropologists is that we'll engage with the kids, we'll help, in this applied project. In this case, what the students and I were doing was we were running some of the events, doing some of the activities and games with the kids. And then at the end of the day, when the when the activities are over, then you go to your field notebook and you write down everything you can remember that we had done, so that you don't lose it, right? We call it a brain dump. You just dump everything you can into your notes. So there was an interesting case study by, I'm blanking on his name. But he went, it was an anthropologist. This is back in the 70s at Rutgers University in New Jersey. And his name will come to me in a second. And he was a junior faculty, so he was probably in his like late 20s, maybe 30-ish. So he was younger, and this was the 70s, so long beards, long hair, bell bottoms type of thing. And they wanted to know, Rutgers University wanted to know more about, it's a big state university, and they wanted to know more about the first year student experience and like how to help kids have a good experience as students and what was going on outside of the classroom and things like that. And he was junior faculty there, just starting out, and he designed a study, so he went undercover. So he wasn't really known that much on campus yet or anything, so he could pull it off because he was young looking too and everything. And he went undercover, and he did, but not really undercover. So he enrolled like a freshman, and he lived in the dorms and like a little, a suite he had roommates and stuff. And he went to classes and took classes and hung out with them, went to the cafeteria, hung out at the places where they'd hang out and shoot pool or billiards or whatever. But it only lasted, it didn't even make it the whole first semester, as I recall, because he, before like his buddies, so he, became buddies with some of the students he was living near. And they started to put it together, like, how come you seem to do so well at these things? And how come you seem to not be bothered by this? So he did get some really good ethnographic information. But as soon as they started to say like, hey, hey, are you old? Are you older and things like that. He didn't hide it. He did come out, and it got to the point where it's like they were like, man, something, and he had to tell him. He said, hey, you guys, look, yes, I'm actually an anthropologist. Yes, I already have my undergraduate degree, and a couple of them were really mad at him, like they were all like, because they had felt tricked, right? And he talks about that in his book too. And so, but it's an interesting. But that's not really what we normally do. When I walk into a community, when I'm talking to somebody, I'm always just going to tell them, hi, I'm here to study medicinal plants. Can I ask you about medicinal plants? And usually people say, oh, I don't know anything about them. Well, okay, well, I heard that you know a lot about them. So, could we just talk and to see what you know? And then they'll agree, But I don't ever not tell somebody, because that's trickery, and I'm not about that. I don't go into even when I'm not necessarily collecting research, but just even if I'm at just a botanical garden and just having a Saturday afternoon, and the tour guide maybe said, it's just the right thing to do, to disclose yourself, to say, hey, well, actually, I study medicinal plants, so I'm really interested in this, so I want to know what you're saying about it, because that's a respectful and decent way to work with people, so that they know where you're coming from and what your perspective is. And that relates into this number 3. Always obtain informed consent and necessary permissions. And it's prior informed consent. I have a really recent example of this. So I'm an editor for a peer-reviewed publication for the Society of Ethnobiology, which means that as an editor, my job is to review all the material and send it out to peer review, and to make sure that all of it adheres to our ethical guidelines and standards for publication. So I have somebody who submitted an article reflecting on stories about animals and culture that she had collected over many years. She's an older scholar, and she had collected this over many years of her life, since the 80s. And they were really neat stories connecting these different cultures to the biodiversity in their communities and things like that. And I asked, I said, okay, I just need to make sure you have permission from the individuals whose stories you're sharing. And the author said to me, she said, well, I do, but it was just, she didn't have, she hadn't told all of the people that she was doing it as a study. Some of it was information that she collected when she was just traveling or living with other cultures. Well, that's not prior informed consent. And so I had to, and it was, maybe probably tough for her, but I said, listen, I really need you to change those stories out then. I need you to give me stories where the person explicitly knew that they were giving you this information for the purpose of research, and they agreed to that when you recorded the story, versus, now, after the fact, like if somebody tells you a really great story and then you say, oh man, I'd like to publish that. Can I have, no, well, if they can give you their permission and they can retell it to you, or you can reconnect with them about it, but that's not the same. So it's always really important to have the informed consent before you do the data collection. And permissions for things like collecting plant specimens or things like that, you need a lot of permission to do that. And I, of course, I don't ever do that without the proper permissions from the local and state and national government. You should always weigh competing ethical obligations due to collaborators and affected parties. I'm very fortunate that I get to recognize, celebrate, acknowledge, and thank the many individuals and communities who participate in my work. Sometimes we're able to collaborate on things, such as like community workshops or presentations or websites, things like that. But it's very important to not just go in and think, I'm just going to go to a community and extract information and then ta-ta. That's really wrong. And that's the sort of thing that like bioprospectors would do or something. And it's important, especially, so for example, I study medicinal plants a lot. It's very important that the indigenous communities that we study retain their rights and ownership of that intellectual property. And so that's to think about. Making your results accessible. There's an ethical obligation that if you do research, you need to publish it. And it needs to be accessible. When I began doing my doctorate work with some indigenous communities that are pretty remote in Mexico, one of the communities identifies as a Zapatista community, and I had friends there. I knew many of the people and leaders in town, and we, I'd spent some time there getting to know people, and I said, well, look, I met with the Council of Elders, and I said, I'd like to do this research project. Here's what it's all about, and here's what I would do in the surveys. And they were like, well, I don't think it's a good idea. And I said, okay, well, can we talk about more? They said, yeah, we can talk about it more. Come again next month. And this process went on for 6 months, from about February till about August, where I came pretty much every month. And pretty much the same kind of, just kind of giving me the runaround. And I knew that, and I was trying to understand what was going on. So, and I did, right? So I listened. So they would invite me to their monthly Council of Elders meetings. And I learned a lot by being there. And I would just listen. And I learned that they had, for many years, had researchers from other universities and other institutions and other businesses, including like Monsanto, come in and ask them for information about plants, go to their fields, take plant samples, things like that, and then leave. And they never knew anything about it. They never knew which publications came from it, what they found out about those plants, if they made money off of that, right? Like Monsanto, and because the place where I work is where they've found the genetic ancestor of corn, maize, teosintl. So it's so there was a lot of interest there from like big GMO agro businesses and things like that. And so I assured them, I said, well, look, I'm not going to make any money off of it, that's for sure. And, I won't do anything like that. But my presence there, and because I collaborated with the university, where some of the researchers had been who had done studies there, or, done community projects and published articles or reports and stuff, and I let them know what was going on. And so it was actually by my presence there that in August, because I'll never forget it, we were there for the Council of Elders meeting, and I think everybody was just as shocked, because we were all sitting inside this little kind of, hut, and we're all sitting in there, and the meeting's getting started, and all of a sudden there's like this cloud of smoke coming up the road. 3 University of Guadalajara trucks pull up. And it was, the whole meeting just kind of like pauses. Everybody's just watching these trucks roll in. And I really don't think anybody knew they were coming. And these 3 white trucks pull up, and out steps, and all these, one of the biggest local researchers here from the local university, and he steps out, and he had a pipe in his mouth. He always has a pipe, his kind of his look. Anyways, and then and a bunch of like students and a couple of other investigators, and they pop out of these trucks, and they walked in there to the council, and they said, oh, excuse us, sorry to get her late. And they set down literally a 2-foot high stack of printouts of articles and reports, and then another stack of like books and CD-ROMs and things like that. And they said, we just wanted to deliver these copies of research and studies that we've done that are about this community. My jaw dropped. I think half the people in the room, like, it was mostly men inside. Most of the women usually sit on the outside. And they were just like, wow, well, thank you, It was so incredible, and it was so impressive. And I just felt really proud. I do think, I can't prove this, but I think that my presence there and me liaison between the community and the local university, and saying like, wow, they're saying that they don't want to let me do my research there because, they've had some bad experiences in the past where they don't know that people just come in and do research and then they leave. And I think that maybe that was something, because anyways, I think it was something that inspired them to show up and say, we owe you these copies of this work that we've done on these communities. So recognize that the information that people share with you, the interview, the survey questionnaire, whatever it is, they give you that information. They are sharing something very personal with you. So protect it and preserve your records. We have an obligation to the scientific and anthropological community, as well as to the people and communities who provided that information. We maintain respectful and ethical professional relationships. Remember when I told you that one of our field school rules was no drinking in the villages? Well, they also had a rule in that list, which was no romantic or sexual relationships in the villages. Now, why? Well, maybe it should be kind of obvious that you come in as an outsider. There's a huge power differential, you have much more power and access to resources and power than they do. There could be some complications there. It could tarnish your reputation or your ability to do objective work in the village, because if you became really connected to one family or one individual and their family, right, that's going to shape how other families then and groups might see you. You become aligned there, whether or not you want to, right? And it's also, anthropologists will usually come and you're there for a set amount of time and then you go and you leave. But what happens to what you leave behind? And you need to think about that too. And of course, we all know, I have many friends who have fallen in love doing their field work and gotten married and had wonderful, long, happy lives and whatever. And that's great. So I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's in here in our code of ethics because it's not something that we would consider commonplace, standard, regular. It's something that you'd really, really want to be careful about if you did have a romantic relationship in the field. But it's really frowned upon. That's an example. And so to keep things professional and always be respectful and try not to get in the middle of village politics or things like that. So I'm going to talk about IRB boards. An IRB, no, we never say herb, so it's just always IRB, is an institutional review board. And that's a committee that's established to review and approve all research involving human subjects. The purpose of an IRB is to help you make sure that your research is rigorous and adhering to all ethical guidelines and principles. And they're set at a federal level, those policies, and the institution will also have, like every institution also has some guidance as well, but for the most part, the basis of the IRB ethical guidelines come at a federal level, and they're really standard. But there's also the equivalent of IRBs in other countries where you might work, and so if you're doing international research, you always want to make sure that you use your home IRB and also the IRB that's applicable in the place where you're going to be doing work. And that means that's the body that's going to give you that prior, right? They're going to review your research and they'll give you your prior informed consent form, that template of how you're going to obtain informed consent, so that before you even start research, you really need to work with your IRB. And then here's something for you to think about. This wasn't one of the assigned readings, but I think you'll find this very interesting if you want to read this news piece and see the political and ethical debate about, it's a tribe that's isolated, the Drawa. Sorry, I don't say it right. And they actually, have a gate and outsiders aren't supposed to encroach, but of course, they have exposure and limited contact with the outside world. And there were lumbers in the right next to their community who would go over and drink and things like that with some of the Jarawa, in particular with the Jarawa women. And there was a young woman who was raped by one of these men and got pregnant. and the Jarawa tribe had to think of, by their own standards, how would they deal with it. And then the Indian government had to think of how they would deal with it, because at the one hand, the Indian government has said, we want these tribes to be protected, to be able to retain their cultural identity and their traditions. And at the same time, the Indian government has their policies and laws and things like that. So it's a quick read. I think you'll find it really interesting, but that's something I'll leave for you to do on your own and think about, like, what should the Indian government do? It's not one of those clear-cut black and white issues. Ethical issues rarely are. So